Hello and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Just a quick reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors, so we would ask that you would consider becoming a regular contributor to the things that we do here. Now, on the podcast today, I am going to be starting a discussion about education, specifically Lutheran education and classical education. And this is something that I am very passionate about for a number of reasons. One is that this is really what I do for a living, is deal with Lutheran education. Through Just and Sinner, I'm hopefully educating all of you who listen to this, and hopefully you learn something from the things that I say, because there's some reason you're listening to me, and producing written materials for people to learn from. And my passion has always been for education more broadly, not just for the more academically inclined, but even children's education as well, which is what I'll be talking about today, especially because I have kids and I care about their education. And it matters a lot to me that there is a rigorous, robust Christian education within the classical school of thought. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I also, for some of you, don't know this, and I hear this from some of you because every time I mention it, people say, I didn't know you did that. But I also am the president of the American Lutheran Theological Seminary, which is the seminary of the AALC. So a lot of my work, my work is basically split between two different callings, and the one is with Just and Sinner, and the other is with ALTS, our seminary with the AALC, and they're both within the field of education. So that's really my passion. And as I have delved into the question of the Benedict option a little bit, we started doing some podcasts on that. I have a number of other things I want to do to address just kind of where we are as a culture and how to handle the serious issues that our culture is facing, and so profoundly in so many ways. I think it's essential for the church to do that. But as we're doing that, we really need to start with education. And education more than just in the field of theology and philosophy as well. Because as I have explored on various other podcasts, you can listen to all sorts of things that I've done on the current gender debates or abortion or deconstruction. I've done a number of videos on a lot of the cultural issues that we are currently facing. But as we look at those issues, I think really the place where we have to start, if we're talking about just the question of what do we do, how do we face this, I think we really need to start with the question of education. So as part of the response to where our culture is, as I've been dealing with, we looked at the Benedict option, the book, and we explored some of that and the call that we have as Christians to create our own institutions, the call that we have to come together to formulate ways to remain faithful in a world that is hostile. We looked at James Davidson Hunter's book as well, which dealt with some similar themes and what his approach to that was. And I said I wanted to move beyond the theoretical then into some of the practical. And I wanted to speak with some people who are actually doing this stuff on the ground. We will be doing that. So hopefully we'll be doing that soon. And I'm going to be speaking with someone who's actually has a career in classical education, who's an educator. But I'm going to lay some of the historical, theological framework here for a classical education from a Lutheran approach. Now, this is really based on a talk that I gave at the AALC's National Convention. I led a little seminar there on the question of education, which there was some back and forth questions and answers. And, I didn't record that largely because it was an interactive format. And when I do that, I don't necessarily want people to have to feel like everything that they say is going to end up publicly on the internet where thousands of people are going to see it. So I decided that I was going to take that material and then record it afterwards because hopefully it will be valuable. And just so you know kind of what my preparation was before I jump into the talk itself, if you want some material to know like what are the materials that I had looked at, the first one that I want to mention is this, which is a handbook of classical Lutheran education. The best of the Consortium for Classical and Lutheran Education Journals. This is a really good series of essays. If you're interested in Lutheran education, specifically classical education, highly, highly recommend this. I took out a bunch of quotes from this thing. They're really excellent. Edited by Stephen Hine, Cheryl Swope, Paul Cahan, and Tom Strickland. So if you want to check that one out, that's a fantastic resource. And not just for Lutherans. I think that the classical model, of course, is far beyond just a Lutheran thing. This is something that Christians from all different traditions are currently talking about and involved in. But that's a kind of uniquely Lutheran take on it. Then Martin Luther, Learning for Life, really, really good book on Martin Luther's stance on education and how Luther viewed education and developed education, both through catechesis in the church, but also through a public education system that he promoted. So really interesting text. And it deals a bit with Melanchthon as well. So really good information if you want to delve into that within Luther. Then The Case for Classical Christian Education by Douglas Wilson. I know he's controversial, and there are plenty of things that I don't agree with that Wilson says, but I found this a pretty good intro primer to the benefits of classical education. Another one here is Teaching the Faith at Home by David Reuter. And this is really about catechesis in the home, because as we're talking about education, I really don't think we can start just in school, because I think that's part of the problem, is that we relegate education to the schools or then Sunday schools to somehow educate your kids in everything they need to know about Scripture and navigating the world. But really, education should and does begin at home. All right, so there's the background. Those are the sources that I used, and now I'm just going to jump into the notes that I have here for the talk that I gave. Now, I think we got to start maybe with what's going on in education today. How do we know that we are at a moment of crisis? I think it's pretty obvious that we're at a moment of crisis right now. And I could give many stories. You know, there are tons of news stories about things that are going on, but I just want to give a few stories of people that I know very well, people that I know personally, and stories that I hear from them. Now, I'm not going to say who or what or where these kinds of things happen, but these are individuals that I know. I see stories like this posted all the time on Twitter, by the way, from educators saying, I've seen this, or we've been told this in our educational system. And I generally see the same responses on Twitter from progressives, which is, that's just made up. You're just making that up. That doesn't happen. This does happen. I know for a fact it happens. And I know that it happens in many communities because I know people that it happens to, and I know them and trust them very much. Okay, so a couple of things just that I've seen to say what the state of education is today, because I think finally a lot of people are kind of realizing the problems of our educational system. And I want to say, before I jump into some of these things that are happening today, there are underlying and systemic problems with the way we have viewed education for a very long time. As we're seeing the erosion of classical thought and just understandings of gender and all sorts of other things in our world today, just basic truth claims. This hasn't come out of nowhere. I know that it's felt in the last 10, 15 years that this kind of cultural erosion has come out of nowhere. And I know that a lot of the new atheist types that are critical of that have said, where did this come from? Why all of a sudden did things get so bad so fast? But really, the erosion has been there for a long time. What we're seeing is not the problem, but what we're seeing is symptoms of the problem. But the symptoms are finally coming to a point where people have now had to step back and say, okay, wait, what's going on? Maybe there's actually a problem here. So in some ways, I'm glad that the radical progressives, the radical left has been as forthright as it has in more recent years, and has, I think, pushed the envelope far beyond a place that they think people will be willing to accept far too fast. And that ends up, I think, being a good thing, because it reveals, I think, the corruption that's underneath that. And that does show up in our educational system. So just some examples of things that are happening today. I know of a school, an elementary school, where there's a bin of different gendered pins. And so there's, he, him, she, her, they, them. I don't know if they have the, bunny self or whatever other neo pronouns people are coming up with these days. But the kindergartners, when they walk into class as a public school, can take those pins and stick them on their outfits, and then everybody knows what pronoun to call them today. Now, of course, they're children, so they're going to do whatever the heck they feel like, and they're going to change them all the time, and they're kids. So you have to know what their pronoun is by looking at whatever pin that they have. So this stuff is introduced extremely early, and it's at the root of a lot of education. I know a public school teacher who was in a school system that was dealing with a lot of this pushing of particular gender ideologies, who spoke with, the administrator of that school and involved in the school board and all sorts of other things there. And there was a big shift in the curriculum, basically toward diversity and inclusion. And it was explicitly stated that diversity and inclusion was actually the purpose of their educational system. That is why they are educating. Of course, not diversity of ideas, but but diversity and inclusion in, what it means these days in our current cultural milieu, it has a very particular meaning. And this one teacher had asked, well, what if I'm not comfortable with some of the things that you're teaching in terms of gender because of, my faith? I don't really believe this because I hold to the view that God created man and woman and created them distinct and that these are not just social constructs. So I'm not really comfortable teaching this kind of curriculum. And this teacher was told basically, you need to quit if you're not going to teach this. So there are school systems, and I know I supposedly it's not as bad in other parts of the country, but I don't know. But at least in many of the liberal areas of the country that I know of, this stuff is being pushed. This stuff is being pushed that explicitly that teachers are having to leave their positions because they are not going to enforce these particular ideas. Another problem that I've seen is parents who are trying to decide what they want to do with their kids in terms of education and are contacting the public schools and saying, hey, what is your curriculum? Because I want to try to decide, do I want to send my kid to private school, public school, homeschool maybe? Can I see what curriculum you're teaching to the kids? Because I want to be informed of my kids' education. And the systems absolutely refuse to give any information about what they're teaching. That is a problem. Like this should make everybody feel uncomfortable that a school system is not willing to be forthright and open about what it is that they are teaching. If there's nothing to be ashamed about, or if they're bold about what they think, if they don't think there's anything wrong with it, you shouldn't have any worries. If I am teaching at a Christian school and someone comes to me and says, what's your curriculum? I'm going to be like, yeah, it's a Christ-centered curriculum. And we believe in God as creator and God and creature as distinct and all the basics of Christianity. If they're not interested, that's fine. They can send their kids somewhere else. But there is I think a lot of red flags go off when you start seeing people that are just trying to hide what's going on. And if they're hiding it, it's things that the parents don't want them to hear. So I have heard of instances where there have been discussions about calling Child Protective Services on parents who push too boldly against the curriculum, parents who complain too much about what their kids are learning in schools. And it is just a fact that the radical left does, at this point, and this isn't everybody, obviously, but there are many on the radical left who are willing to try to take children away from parents for the sake of pushing their religion upon them. As it is a religion, it's a system of values and beliefs and what's right and what's wrong and who's in and who's out. It's scary. It's a really scary time for a lot of parents. Now, something else I've seen in public schooling situations that I've been told about more than once are situations where a school guidance counselor, seeing a student dealing with particular, mental health problems, really pushes them into transitioning to the other gender. This is young. I'm talking elementary school into middle school, very, very young. And so this is a diagnosis basically of, well, maybe the reason that you are dealing with these issues is because you really are a man, or you're really a woman, or you're really non-binary or whatever, and then pushes those kids to transition at school. Of course, none of this is done with parental consent in any way at all. And then we see not just the gender ideology, but I think the gender ideology is probably the clearest indicator of the problems that we are facing today. But it's been more and more common that there is a devaluing of what is quote unquote white Western Christian culture, patriarchal culture. Sorry, I forgot that important part. And increasingly, and I hear this from school teachers, is that there's belief in the gender binary as something that is this just imposition of Christian thought, the focus on logic and mathematics, or the notion of monogamy being this particularly white Christian thing. And, just first of all, historically, it's a completely inaccurate statement in so many ways. And I see this too with people kind of critiquing the purity culture thing in American evangelicalism. And there are plenty of things I have to critique about purity movements in evangelicalism as well. I mean, I was... I saw all of that, and I was, I had the Joshua Harris stuff that I read when I was younger, and all of that, and I'm fully aware of the problems there, and there are. But I see people reacting against this, saying, "Well, that's just a white idea. It's not even a Christian idea. It's just a white idea." And every time someone says that to me, I think of someone that I know from Ethiopia telling me about the situation in the Ethiopian church growing up, and how the teenagers largely are not allowed to take communion in the Ethiopian churches. Because they're seen as so like lustful, because they're teenagers and their hormones are raging, and they're kind of unworthy to take communion because of that. My point is that these focus on things like sexual purity. It's not a white thing. I mean, watch the What Is a Woman documentary recently produced by the Daily Wire, and one of the best parts of the documentary is where Matt Walsh is going over to Africa and speaking to these people that have no connection to colonialism, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" No, what the contemporary liberal progressive gender fluid ideologies. This is the white colonialism that we're trying to force on the rest of the world as upper class Ivy League educated white people. It's exactly the opposite of what the narrative is. I just find it so like fundamentally racist to say that it's only white people that know how to use logic and mathematics, and that's just a white oppressive thing. It's so bizarre. So it always ends up being that it's really the radical left that ends up actually being the ones who have the pretty racist ideologies. And I grew up around all this stuff. I'm not saying this from now. I didn't grow up in a conservative area. I grew up in Massachusetts, and I live in a very, very liberal area in New York as well. So I've seen all of it. All right. So I know you're going to tell me I'm making it all up, whatever. I worked on an Ivy League campus. My neighbors growing up were a Harvard legacy family. I've been around all of this white Ivy League, East Coast elite stuff. It's kind of it's like my world, I get it. Okay, so let's move on. The point is, you all know stories like this. You hear stories like this. You hear it on the news. You see it on social media, and it is happening. Is there some exaggeration in certain places or misinformation somewhere? Yeah, probably. That's the case everywhere. But there really is a danger that's going on in our educational system. So if we're talking about education as from a Lutheran perspective now, that's where we're at. We're at a place that's a mess. So where do we start? If we're going to kind of say everything in this public education system is a hot mess, we got to start over. And I think we do. As a calling, I think part of our calling as a church that we should educate. And I would love to see Lutherans prioritize building schools more than just about anything else. I think this is actually a ministry opportunity that we have that's, as parents, not Christian parents necessarily, or maybe culturally, or maybe not at all. They're just like, well, I don't know what's going on here. This is bad. But we have the opportunity to be the ones who are saying, look, we have a place that we can actually educate children. We're going to just be teaching them history and logic, mathematics, science, just the regular fields of study. They're going to learn the basics of those things in an environment that's not going to push these radical ideas on them. Of course, from a Christian approach. And I think we should be blunt about that. And I think we should be teaching from a Christian approach because I happen to think that's the right one. All right. So how do we do this? Well, let's look back to the Reformation itself. I think we have some guidance there because a lot of education and if you're talking about like the Western world in general, was highly influenced by the Reformation. Now, any reform movement in the church historically is also it tends to be connected with educational movements. So educational reform and clergy reform and theological reform, all of those things are very much tied together. And you see this especially at the time of the Reformation. Now, the Reformation itself wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the Renaissance. And so prior to the Reformation, you have the rebirth of learning in the Renaissance. The saying that defines the Renaissance for many historians is ad fontes, the phrase meaning back to the sources. And so people are starting to kind of critically examine historic Western texts or classical texts. And of course, people read classical texts throughout the medieval period as well. It's not like there's no kind of total lack of education in the medieval period. You certainly have a lot of things going on with the scholastics. I tend to think if you look at Aquinas, and not just Aquinas or Anselm, I mean, in terms of just their logical rigor and massive outputs, I mean, they put me to shame for sure. And I think they would anybody really in the modern world. So it's not like education was totally missing and there's this period of the Dark Ages. It really, even that moniker, the Dark Ages, comes about as a kind of Enlightenment response to the supposedly like ignorant Christian West at that time. There was plenty of learning happening. But you have these various times when you have kind of rebirths of learning. You have a kind of mini Renaissance under Charlemagne, though I know that some historians have challenged whether that's actually really much of a Renaissance or how big that was. But some kind of Renaissance under Charlemagne. And you have some figures like Alcuin and these others, Carolingian educators and theologians involved in that. But then as you get closer to the end of the medieval period, you get the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is well known for painting, for a change in the way that people approached art and painting that was much more similar to ancient Rome and ancient Greece, that was much more focused on a kind of realism, though not an explicit realism quite in the sense that you get in some later art in the 19th century. But so you get more realistic paintings, a lot more of a connection to the classical Greek and Roman myths. And with that comes a rediscovery of a lot of classical documents. You have the recovery of Aristotle with Aquinas, and that's also within the Islamic world. So it's not even just in the Christian world that happens, but you have a rediscovery of a lot of classical sources. And the Renaissance people start doing things like actually learning Hebrew again instead of just using the Latin Vulgate. And this at times was illegal, that there were scholars who were studying under rabbis to learn Hebrew because it was illegal for a Christian to learn from a rabbi. So oftentimes this was done in secret, that they could learn the Hebrew language. So people are going back to the original languages, original sources. This leads to a number of findings historically that are going to start to put into question some of the claims of the papacy, and other claims as well. But the papacy, the major one, and this is not the only by any means, but something called the Donation of Constantine, where you have this power that was authorized to the Pope from Constantine, and this was found to be a forged document, a fraudulent document. Now that people are starting to more critically examine text and say, well, when was this actually written? Is there evidence that was, redacted? How old are these manuscripts? Those kinds of questions start to be asked. And as people do that, now people are looking at the New Testament text, and they're looking at the Greek text as opposed to just the Latin Vulgate that had been used. And now they're looking at the Masoretic text in Hebrew and comparing that to the Latin Vulgate. And this puts into question a lot of the claims that the medieval church had made regarding the papacy, or about just translation issues. Because if you have something like John the Baptist saying, do penance for the kingdom of heaven is at hand in the Latin Vulgate, and all of a sudden you start to actually read the Greek text and realize that no Greek manuscript has, and whatever tradition, has that at all as an option. This is repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Well, that's pretty significant. That's going to pretty significantly change the way that you view the subject of penance and its connection to the New Testament. So you have a number of findings like this. So that means that it was the rebirth of learning and examining the text, particularly the biblical text, largely the New Testament, but the Old as well, that leads then to the doctrinal developments that become the Protestant Reformation. So we could say that this rebirth in education really stands at the beginning of the Reformation itself. Now, of course, Martin Luther, as he is formulating his ideas, engages in a number of public academic disputations. He's an academician. He receives his doctorate in theology. Luther continually said that his authority to speak was the authority that was granted to him when he became a doctor of theology. The church declared him a doctor of theology, and he said, when I was given that call, he didn't feel it wasn't a self-chosen call, it was a given call. He said, that was my call, and as I'm called to be the doctor of theology, I study theology, and I teach what Scripture says. That's the vow that he took, and he would do that until his dying day. Regardless of what you think of Luther and his conclusions, that's certainly what he saw himself as doing, is continuing that education and continuing that legacy that he was given there. So you have a rise in new universities. So the University of Wittenberg then is a new school where Luther starts teaching, and soon it becomes like the most significant school of the Reformation, which seemingly was just kind of a random place that wasn't that important for the empire per se, if you can call the Holy Roman Empire an empire, but they at least call themselves that. But you have this birth of these new universities. Luther himself is engaged in academic disputation. For example, it's in an academic disputation where Luther is accused of being a Hussite, a follower of John Huss, who was considered a heretic at Constantinople, and condemned to death there. That Luther then says, I'm not a Hussite, then goes back between, because he had these breaks between these disputations. You could have like days of debates. It would be like an entertaining thing. I wish people would still go to like debates to get entertained. People cared about ideas enough, but we're too like brain dead to do that. Or we think we are, but at the same time, you do look at the popularity of Jordan Peterson or other figures who do talk for hours and people listen. Like, people listen to me. I'm just what am I? I'm just some kind of academic rambling on about theology, and enough of you sit here and listen to my hour-long talks. So I don't think it is dead, actually. I think that probably I think there's actually a shift in some ways for younger people away from mindless entertainment, probably into a more thinking perspective, and I think that's a very good thing. But you see that with these disputations, and then so Luther takes this break. They come back the next day. Luther had a chance to read Huss, and he says, "We are Hussites. Huss was right." Whoa. He's really admitting that he's aligning himself with one who was considered a heretic. And that was such a significant moment for the Reformation. And he starts to allow that the Pope could be wrong in that same debate. So, he's making some quite controversial statements. But this happens because of a rebirth of learning, and because questions are being asked, because there is now an openness to actually ask things like, are these documents really historical or are they not? And so the free nature of academic discourse leads essentially to the Reformation. So in light of that, it shouldn't be surprising to us that Luther very much values education. And you see this in a number of different places in Luther's writings. One place you see this is when he speaks about monasticism, where Luther is very critical of monasticism in many ways. He's at least critical of the works righteousness of monasticism. Now, to be clear, there are monastic kind of movements within Lutheranism at times. There actually are some, not many, but some monasteries that are actually fully converted and people remain monks. There's still some Lutheran monastics today. Not a lot, but they still do exist. Well, Luther mostly is critical of monasticism because of the works righteousness that was so tied to it, as well as the notion of a lifelong vow of celibacy, especially that people were pushed into at a very young age. And we could do a whole program on monasticism. I actually did one in the past, but that was years ago, and it was something I'd love to revisit. And in this Benedict Option series, this is kind of a part of, we are going to be speaking with some people who are looking into ways to actually incorporate monastic ideas in a Protestant context in a way that is not identical with medieval monasticism, but takes the good of medieval monasticism and says, how can we take these ideas and apply them in a way that's good and faithful today, that's consistent with the Protestant doctrine of justification through faith alone. But when Luther does speak positively about the monastics, what he most often says, other than just quoting Bernard of Clairvaux, because he loves Bernard and he was the best of the monks, Luther would often say, is that he praises their educational system. So he recognized that the monks, as much as there were things to criticize in many ways, they were the ones that preserved the texts of the church, not even just the texts of the church, but the texts of the West, and they were places of learning. And Luther said that was good. We want to retain the kind of learning that happened in the monasteries, but we want to make that accessible beyond just the monastic life. That kind of learning should be a value that all people have, because God has given us all minds. And this is part of Luther's doctrine of vocation, where he's trying to equalize all people in the sense that he's going to say, not that there are no distinctions and roles and functions in society. The Anabaptists do some of that, but Luther certainly upholds societal hierarchy in various ways as just kind of necessary for proper functioning of society. But he sees that we all of us, regardless of whether you have a church calling or you're called to be a soldier or if you're a peasant or whatever, we all have equal value before God. We all have equal standing before God, and we all should have equal access to Scripture, because God wants us all to know Him, not just the learned classes, but He wants all to know Him. So that, for Luther, meant that there had to be some kind of accessibility in education beyond just that of the monks or the pastors or the priests. That was to be brought down to the common people. So maybe the first way that we tend to think of that Luther promoted education was in the writing of the catechisms. Now, the small catechism was to be used at home. It was to be used for the father to teach to his family. And Luther understood, I think rightly understood, that education does begin at the home. Now, we see this principle all throughout the Old Testament, especially the Old Testament, because there just is a bit more about education in the Old Testament. Look at the book of Proverbs, look at what people are instructed to do, like in Deuteronomy with their children, that the fathers are called to teach the faith to their children. They are called to instruct. And it's not just the father, by the way. Proverbs goes back and forth between the wisdom of the father and the wisdom of the mother. Though it does, especially in the early chapters, kind of take this father to son stance. There's plenty of talk about the mother as well. So the instruction comes from the parents, and it is brought into the life of the child. So it is really the parents who are those who teach primarily. That's the foundation. Now, that doesn't end there. And Luther's going to say it doesn't end there, but we have to have a beginning there. As if you are a parent, you should strive to have the beginning there within your own home. And ideally, that means that you teach your kids the catechism at home. Now, I know we've regulated that to church, so that the pastor teaches the catechism. Kids come to catechism class and they have never heard of Abraham or Moses before, and the pastor has to start at square one. Ideally, this is something that the kids are taught at home. This is something that the parents are supposed to inculcate in their children as best they can. Now, every parent has various, educational levels, knowledge of the faith. You don't have to be an expert theologian, though, to teach your kids the Ten Commandments and the Lord's Prayer or the Apostles' Creed, or to just read the catechism with them, or to just read Bible stories with them. It doesn't necessitate an expertise in the area of theology. So Luther saw that the ideal was that the catechism would be something that would be taught at home regularly. And this is something I will probably deal with this in a future podcast, which is how do you teach your children at home? So I do plan on doing something like that. And I did something in the past on something in that area. I know a long time ago with my wife, we did a discussion about that, but we're still trying to figure it out. But kids were younger at the time. But I do want to go back to that at some point. And then the large catechism was for the purpose of pastors, because Luther found in these visitations that he did that pastors themselves didn't even know the Ten Commandments. They didn't know anything. And so the large catechism was a series of sermons that he preached and then wrote down and gave to people to say, here, at least the pastor can at least have this. You got to know the chief parts of the Christian faith. You got to know what the sacraments are. You got to know the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and the Ten Commandments. So at least start there as a foundation. But beyond just the church education and the education in theology, Luther also actually promoted public education. He promoted a kind of public schooling. Now, he actually writes a letter to the princes telling them to establish Christian schools. He's got a little treatise, and it's called something like that. I can't remember the exact name, and I don't have the name of it written down. I've read it a couple times. But Luther is arguing for the establishment of public schools. But these were Christian public schools. Oh no, Christian nationalism here. This was Christendom, right? This was a Christian world. There was no such thing as a secular state in the 16th century. The notion of secularity comes about at the time of the Enlightenment. There's no secular government at this time. And it's understood that if you're going to be teaching kids, you're going to teach from a religious viewpoint, and you got to pick a religion. So they're Christians, so they believe it should be Christian. So the state is going to establish Christian schooling. That's what Luther desires. And so he has this proposal. And it's an important proposal just for the history of education. So regardless of whether you're a Lutheran or even a Christian or not, it's an important part of the history of how education is to be understood in the West. So that Luther argued that a public education was a good that all people should have. And he says, you're spending all your money on infrastructure, basically, roads and all of this other stuff. And he's like, who cares about the stuff of the body if the soul isn't taken care of and the mind isn't taken care of? And so he saw this as the greatest need and necessity of people in a society, was that if you're going to spend tax funds on anything, you spend that tax money first on education. And so that's right at the top of the hierarchy of needs, if you want to use that kind of language. But it's necessary for people. It's so necessary. So Luther then argued that we should have a public education system that supplements education that happens at home. Now, he gives a few reasons for this. But one of those reasons was Luther understood that not everybody was equipped to teach at home. Not everybody is equipped to homeschool. And I think that's true today, too. We certainly are more educated as a society than we were in the 16th century. I mean, most people are literate to some degree in the Western world, at least today. Though, some people aren't. And of course, I know that I have listeners from all over the place that aren't necessarily in the Western world or societies where people are generally as literate as they are in at least the United States. So it's true that people are more literate today, but Luther recognized some people just aren't equipped to do that. They're not they're not gifted in that way. And so while every parent is certainly called to do some teaching at the home, not everybody is called to be able to equip somebody full time. In a homeschooling environment. Now, I support homeschooling. I think it's a really good idea if you can do it, and I think people do it very successfully, and it's certainly something that I think that Christian parents should consider. We certainly considered it. We went back and forth about what we wanted to do with our kids, and decided that Christian schooling we thought ended up being a better option for a number of reasons. But some people choose to homeschool, and that ends up being a good option. But not everybody is equipped to do it for a variety of reasons. So Luther said, well, we should have a daily education. And he said this is not just to be for the upper class. So Luther believed that basic education, instruction in how the world works, but largely in the Christian faith, was something that could be used regardless of what your actual job was, which means that the goodness of education goes beyond just preparing you for a job. And this is the major problem that we find in education today, is people approach education as this is the thing you do to prepare yourself to make money so you can be productive in society and make money. And in a capitalistic society, post-Enlightenment, post-Industrial Revolution, it makes sense that we do that because we prize productivity over pretty much all other things. So education takes this massive, massive shift. But Luther doesn't see that is the purpose of education. He says that, if you're going to be a farmer, or if you're trained to do whatever job from your parents, you should continue in that apprenticeship at home and get education there. But he also believed that there should be supplemented to that. We should establish this life of the mind and the life of the spirit that can be used because it's good for you. It's good for the development of character. It's good for the development of the person. Regardless of whether that's going to be influential in helping you make more money, who cares? I mean, why is that important? Yeah, sure, you could be a really good cobbler, and you make the same amount of money, whatever your level of education is, as long as you know how to make shoes well. But it's going to be beneficial for you as a person, and in terms of your faith and your understanding of God and your understanding of the world and the culture that you're a part of. So it is a good thing regardless of what it does for you in terms of making money. We very much miss that in our world today. So Luther promoted a kind of educational system which was it's not a full day of public education. He's not saying, you drop your kids off at 8 and pick them up at 3 or whatever. In his proposal, this was basically 2 hours a day. You spend, because it's expected that you are going to be, working with your dad on the farm or learning things at home, staying with your, mom and learning to cook or whatever you're doing. You are learning things at home, but this is something in addition to that. And Luther did open up this education beyond just men as well. For Luther, this was an education for men and women, because men and women are both to be equipped in the life of the spirit and the life of the mind and the life of faith. This is equally valid for both men and women. So that's a pretty... at the time, of course, this is quite a statement. But Luther very much valued education beyond the boundaries of class or gender to be offered to all. I think it's also important to note that as Luther's talking about education, he often does this in his conflicts with the Anabaptists as well. So it does show up in his actual proposals about establishing specific things. But he writes against the notion of the Anabaptists that because we have the Holy Spirit, we don't really need a formal education. So in terms of like a formal theological education, Luther is going to say, no, we need formal education. God has given us brains. He's given us his word. God has chosen to reveal himself through words that have to be read. And whether you're able to read or you're hearing someone else read it, someone's got to read it. So God communicates through information. So he's given us minds. That's the way that we absorb and receive what God has given us through his word. So we can't simply say, follow the impulses of the Spirit that now says, well, education doesn't matter as long as you have the Spirit. Now, Luther understood we're created as with mind and heart, and all of that needs to be fed and instructed and taught in a variety of different ways. And that includes education. Something that's also, I think, worth noting in Luther is that Luther sees this as really essential for both kingdoms. So we talk about the left-hand realm, and if you're not familiar with the Lutheran terminology here, with our two kingdoms theology, this is the realm of culture. This is the realm where, we're talking about government, we're talking about jobs, culture, that which is distinct from the kingdom of grace, or the kingdom of the right, which is through the church, word and sacrament. so that, in this, what you might call common kingdom, we have Christians and non-Christians, together. And in the kingdom of grace, those who are most properly in the kingdom of grace are only those of faith, right? But in this common realm, in terms of just temporal things, the things of the body, the things governed by natural law, Luther would say that education is necessary there for us to function as a society well, to the point that he's like, God's going to punish you if you don't do it. He's pretty blunt about this. And in the spiritual kingdom as well, he's called us to catechize and teach the word. So education is necessary in both realms. On the one hand, we have to learn moral reasoning. We have to learn, just intellect in terms of, if you're going to go into a scientific field or a field of technology or business, you have to learn in various ways how to interact with people, how the world functions, how economics work, all of these kinds of things. So education is necessary, but education is also necessary in the church because that's how we learn who God is and our place in God's story of redemption and what that means for us. So it's not just, however, Luther who is a proponent of education within the Lutheran Church. So Philip Melanchthon, Luther's kind of right-hand man, a little younger than Luther, but just as important as Luther is for the Reformation in many ways. Melanchthon is also a very influential figure within Germany in the development of an understanding of education for the Protestant world as a whole. And so that certainly means within Germany, but outside of the borders of Germany as well. Melanchthon is a significant figure far beyond just the Lutheran Reformation. Now, Philip Melanchthon was a little bit more of a humanist than was Luther. And by humanist here, I don't mean secular humanist. If you're not familiar, what I mean is we're talking about the humanist movement, which is part of the Renaissance. So those who emphasize learning in terms of the humanities of, literature and theology or philosophy, art, music, those are all connected with the humanities. So Melanchthon is more of a humanist. Melanchthon is more interested in, say, classical Greek sources. He cites the classical Greek philosophers a lot more. He cites Virgil a lot more than Luther does. Now, it doesn't mean Luther doesn't have an acquaintance with them, because he does, but Luther's focus tends to be a little more narrowly on theology, because that's his call. It's theology. Melanchthon is a little broader in his understanding of learning and what he wants to emphasize as is important for especially the common kingdom. So Melanchthon believes in the importance of a liberal arts education and argues that we should provide a liberal arts education to all people of all classes, just as Luther is going to say. So he promotes specifically the teaching of languages. He talks about the importance of teaching poetry, of grammar, mathematics, and of history. Now, what you don't see in there is, the sciences. That doesn't mean Melanchthon does not believe in teaching the sciences. Of course, the world is very different today. We tend to emphasize the science, especially in higher education. In some ways, we only really have the sciences because the humanities don't even really exist anymore in most educational institutions. They've just been replaced by, propagandists who are just really teaching their own, political and sociological theories under the guise of literature or under the guise of art or whatever it may be. It's not really humanities anymore at all in any consistent, coherent sense. So the humanities hardly even exist in our educational institutions today, at least in any meaningful way. They've really been replaced by sociology and gender theory. But we emphasize the sciences because science produces things. Science makes money. And especially the learning of, new technologies. As technologies grow, people want more technology. You can make a lot of money off technologies. And there are companies that will pay you to research lots of things at a school that you're not going to have. You're not going to have that kind of funding for a study of, Jane Austen or something, in literature, as you are to, have a program that's going to maybe help do research that for something that NASA is going to use. A lot more funding goes to those kinds of things, especially the technology that ends up being useful for us, that people are going to buy or they're going to consume, which I guess that wouldn't really be NASA so much, but hey, yeah, you know what I mean. All right, so Melanchthon divides education into three stages in his proposal. The first is largely memorizations. So he sees that when you're young, the focus should be the memorization of prayers and in the catechism. So we're talking like the Lord's Prayer, Luther's morning and evening prayer, I'm sure other prayers as well, and then the small catechisms. Then second, you have a focus on proper grammar and language. So you do the memorization early, and this kind of makes sense. Kids certainly learn languages much earlier. They memorize things. Their brains work differently when they're very young. You memorize things really easily at that age. And then as you can, systematize things a little better, because a lot of times the memorization, the kids won't be able to think through the implications of what they've memorized right when they memorize it. They just know the words. And the goal, though, and people see memorization as like pointless. A lot of people seem to think that because it doesn't touch the heart. It's just like a bunch of facts that you've stuffed in your head. But when you have the facts stuffed in your head at a young age, then when you actually need them or are old enough to actually interpret them or use them, you got it all stored right here. So it's beneficial for you. It's not supposed to just stay as facts in your head. It is supposed to actually be incorporated into your life in a variety of ways. But you need to know the facts first before you can actually do that. So the second stage would be a focus on grammar and language. And then third, you have the study of classical sources. And so I know Melanchthon specifically mentions Cicero and Virgil. So we're thinking about a lot of the classic Roman sources. So the Aeneid, if you're not familiar with Virgil, the guy who leads Dante through his journey in the afterlife in Dante's Inferno. This also was not just to be the reading of these classical sources, but Melanchthon also promoted the writing of poetry and the writing of letters by students. So you would understand these classical sources and the conventions of grammar and rhetoric and learn how to communicate well, but also how to do it beautifully. Because poetry is learning how not to just communicate information, but to make it beautiful, to make it speak well. And so when you're doing that, you're not looking at facts as just information, but you're learning how to form those things together and present them well. We also have the importance of music. This is something that is certainly this is the development at the time of the Reformation, is this emphasis on hymnody, and an emphasis on hymnody in the languages of the people, an emphasis on congregational singing that wasn't there prior to this, to that extent. And this is really the best way you learn, is through singing songs. They say that hymns are the sermons that you remember, which I think is very true, because, I could preach a sermon and ask people the next week what I preached on. They have no idea. But if I ask them the words of a hymn that they know well, yeah, that's going to stick with them. Music just does that. Music communicates well. This is why there are versions of like Luther's prayers, morning and evening prayer, that are sung that we used with our kids, and they memorized it well that way. That's just, it sticks with us better when we have a tune. But it also communicates beauty at the same time. It engages us in our spirit, not just in our minds when we sing. So singing is a wonderful and important part of education as well. So I want to ask the question then. We're summarizing, this is where Luther was at, this is where Melanchthon was at. There's kind of the background of the importance of education for the Reformation and how they saw education. But I want to ask a question I think is really essential as we are thinking about, well, anything really, is what is its end? What is its goal? What is it for? What is it doing? And that's really the key question that I think we have to ask about education, just like we do with anything else. And it's not just a matter of, because I think a lot of the kind of critics of what's going on in the education system today are seeing little pieces of what's going on, are like, this is bad, and this is bad. I don't like the facts that they're teaching. But we have to go a lot deeper than that. We have to go deeper than just are they teaching facts that are not facts? or are they presenting things badly? But what is guiding them? What is the purpose of your educational system? Why does your school exist? What is the goal of what your students are going to be and do after they get out of here? And here is where we talk about something that's called the hidden curriculum. Now, this hidden curriculum is, in a lot of writings on education, I've encountered people using this term hidden curriculum, and this basically it's kind of a way to say the worldview. It's really actually not that different from worldview at all. Maybe it would be a synonym, but all education has values that it endorses, It has purposes that it has in mind. It has goals in what it is doing. There is no purely non-ideological sphere of just brute facts that are totally uninterpreted by the human subject. Everything is interpreted. Everything is taught with presuppositions underneath what's being taught. And the Enlightenment had this kind of notion that we can, as human beings, be these objective observers of facts, that we could have a kind of God's eye view, as people say, of reality. So we're just these kind of intellects who can totally dispassionately, take ourselves away from the facts and just say, okay, here are the facts. These are the facts. I can just talk about the facts, and now I put them together, regardless of what my own beliefs about this or that are. We don't do that. We are not made to do that. It's not how human beings function. We function based upon goals. We all have purpose. We all bring presuppositions about what meaning is, about purpose, about values, what matters, what doesn't matter, what's right, what's wrong. Now, our education can certainly challenge those things and those underlying beliefs and presuppositions and whatnot. They can shift. But we can't pretend that we don't have them. And understanding that is so key, because when we understand that, you recognize there is no such thing as secular education. That is, it's a myth. It is something that was made up by the Enlightenment, and it doesn't exist. There is no secular education. And what we're seeing now in our educational systems is just the fruit of that. Because of course there's no secular. Nobody teaches from a valueless system. And so if you're not going to teach the values of one religion or another religion, something's got to take its place, right? Like we are oriented toward something that is good. If you're a teacher, you want something for your students. There has to be some kind of good that you desire for your students. That's what motivates you to teach. So it motivates you to do anything in life. We're motivated by purpose and meaning. So what is the purpose? Now, what you see these, teachers on TikTok who are coming out to their students and doing all sorts of wild things. What they're doing is saying, this is my meaning and purpose. They've interiorized it, because they've lost all sense of any outward meaning and purpose, because the world is just random chaos and just all self-interpreted. So what do? Well, I want to have purpose in my role, so I need to bring purpose to my students. Well, how do I do that? Well, I found it within me through this radical gender ideology that I've developed, so now I'm going to bring it to my students, because we want them to have meaning and purpose. Of course we do. That's how we function. So if you get rid of any classical Christian or whatever, it could be any other religion as well, but when you get rid, of course I think Christianity is the right one, but my point is you have a religion, regardless if it's a formal religion or you're teaching New Age, whatever it is, you have some kind of faith, you have some kind of religion, because you have a value system that you are imparting to your students. Even if it's an Enlightenment materialistic atheism, you are bringing those presuppositions and that understanding of the world to your students. You have to, if that's what you believe, because it forms how you think. This is why atheists, all the new atheists were so passionate about their atheism. Because the reality is, if there's no meaning or inherent purpose in anything, it's all just self-made. Who cares if other people aren't atheists or believe things that are crazy? There's no value in truth over untruth. Who cares? Because there's no value in anything. But they don't live like that. They live under this meaning that they found in their atheism. And now it is their goal in life to communicate their atheism to others and convert others to their cause. Because we are creatures that search for meaning and purpose. That's just what we do. That is our nature. Okay. So we aren't these objective observers as the Enlightenment would like to see. So we have to ask then, okay, if that's the case, there has to be a hidden curriculum. There has to be a worldview that we are approaching education with. So the question is just, what is that? You can pretend it doesn't exist and you're just being naive. It does exist. Acknowledge that it exists and say, what is it? What is that underlying belief? What are the underlying values that we are communicating? Now, there are a number of different answers to this, and I'm going to summarize this rather quickly because I'm running out of time here. And I could do, if you want me to, if people like this, I'll do another one. Okay, but the foundations of what we call progressive education. Now, progressive education, I'm not talking about just contemporary progressivism, but we're talking about the development of educational movements throughout the 20th century, that you have the rise of industrialization. And with the rise of industrialization, a lot more people are, working in factories. They are working at producing things. There's an emphasis on both production, but also consumption. You want people to buy stuff because the more you buy stuff, the more other people have jobs in order to produce stuff. And the more that they produce more stuff, the more money the heads of those production companies get and the wealthier they get. This is why you have the insane wealth gap in the end of the 19th century with what they call the Gilded Age, where you have these it's insane, the gap, the wealth gap between the industrialized workers and then the owners of those plants. And it's actually my favorite. I love that era. I love reading about that era. It's such a fascinating read to see the dynamics and abuses of the upper class then. Anyway, Edith Wharton is my favorite author, and she writes about all that stuff all the time. But with industrialization then, what we start to prize as good is production, because it benefits the world. New technologies, people are buying stuff, people are happier when they have more stuff. And that means that education, if it's going to serve society best, is going to produce good workers, because society is formed around buying and selling. And if you want people to do well in that society, to help that society, they must be also good at buying and selling. And there then comes a shift in education, where education is no longer about the formation of character in the person, as someone like Luther would clearly say. But this is just classical education as well. I mean, this is in the ancient Greek philosophers, and throughout the Middle Ages, this is emphasized too. But there's a consistent testimony to education being for the purpose of the development of individual character. But now it's about job, about careers. And this is also the case because you start to have some flexibility in terms of what your career is. Now there's freedom in choosing a career. In the past, largely, and it depends on the society and depends on what vocation you want, but largely you don't have a lot of mobility in terms of choosing what your job is going to be. I mean, even like pastors, it was often expected, hey, you're a pastor, your kid's a pastor, their kid's a pastor, their kid's a pastor. So you have this line of pastors. Or you grow up on the farm and you learn to farm. In agricultural communities, this still happens much more. But in more industrialized communities, you don't have this as much. You have a lot of social mobility. You can kind of bounce between this job and that job, and people can change jobs every couple of years. So you're now not thinking, well, of course I'm going to be a farmer with my dad, so that's what you're going to do. You've got that part of your life settled, but you want to go to school too. You're learning, and you may think, I want to go to college and maybe get a degree in business agriculture or something that I can use to help my work on the farm or whatever. But you're doing it for the purpose of something you already have in place. Of course, when there's more mobility, now you're thinking, I need to get educated so I can figure out what my job is going to be, and then get educated for that job so I can make money, so I can provide for my family, so that I can survive in the world. So the focus totally shifts. And this eventually leads to the humanities really disappearing altogether. I mean, the humanities, they're not productive. You don't learn art and literature to just make money or produce things or make new technologies. You learn them because they're good for you, because they help you think. They're good for your soul. They're good for your emotions. They're good for you as a person. They unite you to people in your culture or in other cultures and bring you beyond yourself into the broader world and people that have lived in the past and in other places than you have. It's not productive. But when we have this production-minded society, we don't know what to do with the humanities, so they get thrown out and they just become another tool for political activism. Because that's something you could do with them. Because we want something you can do. We don't want just stuff that's beautiful, that you can just enjoy and delight in. No, you want things you could do something with. So at the very least, you got to make them something you can use as political activism to go fight somebody you don't like, or to protest, or to push this law or that law, or whatever. We don't see them as valuable in and of themselves, which they are. So what is then, in contrast to that, the goal of classical education? Now, I've just got two quotes here that I want to read. These are both from Stephen Hine. And Stephen Hine has some really good essays, as I mentioned in that volume on Lutheran classical education. And he says this. He says, the goal of classical education is to raise up a virtuous, educated person who knows in a normative way himself, his world, and his God. So you see, this is about the individual. It's about the person. The person growing in virtue, growing in character, learning about God, learning about the world. It has a meaning far beyond just production and money. The second quote I have is from him as well on the goal of education. He says, the goal of education is to equip the learner with fundamental skills and arts to enable independent, significant inquiries into knowledge, especially to ask questions and find answers about meaning, purpose, and value of things. So it's about asking, learning, knowing how to ask, knowing how to think, how to communicate, giving you the basic tools so that you, as a human, can now navigate the world in a sensible and rational, but meaningful and purposeful way. So then I got these concluding points here as we finish. We have a lot of challenges just that we're facing today to education. And as Christians, we have to be really conscious of what those challenges are. I think it's very apparent to many of us. But the world is increasingly hostile to Christianity. And when I say the world, I don't mean the whole world, but certainly Western Europe and the United States. And so at least in the Western world, things are very hostile to Christianity. This also means, though, that culture is increasingly hostile toward questions. I mean, you can hardly ask any questions today without getting a label. And so if you say, well, where do we have, though, any studies on, the long-term effects of gender transition on children, whether that's really going to be beneficial? We don't, by the way. Do we have any long-term studies on that to see if that's really going to be psychologically helpful for those children? You can't ask that question. You're labeled, a bigot or whatever, and then you're booted off whatever social media platform, which is kind of the public forums today. It's just like every day it seems like I'm on a lot of subreddits. I spend time on Reddit. On a lot of it, honestly, is just like Star Wars leaks. But I increasingly am seeing all these people getting booted out of subreddits for things that are just absurd. It's just asking a question. Now, some people are jerks. Okay, I know, and sometimes people are kicked out because they're being jerks, and I get it. But sometimes it's you just ask a question, and instead of there being any discourse, it's just you're gone. You're this or you're that. I saw one subreddit said that they would kick anybody out who mentioned PewDiePie because he's a bigot or something, which was bizarre. I don't know. And it's social media. It's not the thing that matters the most, but it does show you where a lot of people's minds are at today. Also, we have this issue in society today that people are overeducated, but also unable to think. And oh boy, do I see this in working on an Ivy League campus and seeing students who they're very intelligent people, and they know a lot and will do well for themselves in life. But you often see that the basic reasoning skills are just any kind of critical thinking toward whatever ideas are being pushed from academia. They're just sometimes not questioned at all. Because I think sometimes those skills aren't really developed. You learn how to take a test well, you learn how to produce things in society well, and that's great, and that will help you in life, but you don't necessarily learn how to critically engage ideas. You know how to write a good essay, you know how to write the right answers on a test, you know how to do a project well, but that doesn't mean that you know how to critically think and critique and examine. And that's really missing from even a lot of our best educational systems today. Even some of those, universities that are, top level universities in the United States. So people are educated a lot. They get a lot of degrees, but often there are basic elements of just formal logic that they don't really understand at all. And I think that this just presents an opportunity for us that we have an opportunity as a church. We have an opportunity to be a voice of reason in the world right now. And to be a place where we allow questions, and we should, We open up space for people to ask questions, even very critical, difficult questions, where we can actually provide an education that teaches them how to think. And at least if somebody comes out of there disagreeing with you, at least they know what you think and how to think. And if they don't agree with you, all right. That's what it is. But you want them to have a place where people can actually learn about culture, learn about God, most importantly, learn about how to navigate the world, learn about logic and grammar and rhetoric. And of course, the sciences are certainly an essential part of this. I don't mean to be devaluing the sciences. I'm just emphasizing the humanities because that's the part that we've really lost, not because I think the sciences aren't important. So then in a classical education model, this often follows what's known as the trivium and then the quadrivium. The trivium are the three foundations of logic, grammar, rhetoric. You have a logic stage, grammar stage, and then you have the rhetoric stage after that. Then you have the quadrivium, which is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So these are the basics of what a classical education is. Now, I'm going to get more in depth into a classical education, whether that's just me or if I have somebody else. I'm definitely going to have a classical educator on to talk about it who's actually in this work day to day. Because something I read about, but it's not something I guess I do actually incorporate this a lot at home with my kids. I make my kids learn a lot. They're in school all day, but then they come home and I teach them things at home. And we have discussions about theology and philosophy and all sorts of fun things. I have two boys, 7 and 9. But I think they need it. I think it's good for them. So I actually do take these things and I use them. I use these tools at home, even though I'm not an educator. And I think it's good for parents to know this stuff anyway. Well, I guess I am an educator. I just mean I'm not a classical educator in the sense of I'm teaching kids my age in school. Okay. Well, I hope you found this somewhat helpful. I know people were interested in the subject of Christian schooling and have wanted me to talk about it a little more. So here you go. Hope you find this helpful. If you don't, that's fine. Let me know what you think in the comments, or if you want me to do more, I totally could dive into this a lot. I really care about this issue. So any comments, questions you have related to this, please let me know. And thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and in your podcast app. We'll see you in the next one. God bless.